Hello, welcome to this presentation on AC 2.3 of Unit 4 of the WJEC Level 3 Criminology course. And this assessment component looks at how the forms of punishment meet the aims of punishment. Now, we already looked at the aims of punishment in an earlier presentation. Now we're looking at how the forms of punishment meet those aims. There is always a question on this. It's usually 9 marks. Sometimes there are 2 questions. In the past, I've seen two 9-mark questions on this, so nearly a quarter of the whole exam on this AC. So it's a really important one. So let's dive into it. So in this topic, we're looking at how the sentences handed down by the courts meet the 5 aims of punishment. Now, the 5 aims of punishment are retribution, rehabilitation, reparation, deterrence and protection. Remember back to that 2003 Criminal Justice Act reference that I gave you in AC 2.2. So retribution, rehabilitation, reparation, deterrence and protection. Those are your aims. Now, as far as the forms of punishment goes, they are related to the sentencing framework. So in this country, we have 4 basic types of sentence that are used by courts to punish offenders. They are imprisonment, community sentences, fines and discharges. So if you are found guilty in a court in this country, you may get 1 or more of these sentences. Okay. Now, the way the framework works is that it goes from least serious to most serious. So an absolute or conditional discharge is the least serious sentence that a court could give you, then a fine, then a community order, and then imprisonment, custody. Sometimes fines and community orders can go together, but it's neither here nor there. There's a hierarchy of sentencing in this country. So basically, this AC is looking at how do these relate to these. So I'm going to go through each of the 4 punishments and then relate it to each of the 5 aims of punishment. Now, it is possible that you could think of other aims of punishment that link in here, and it's not an inexhaustive list, and if you can find a way of tying that in, there's no problem with this whatsoever. But what you've got to do is show that you understand how the things work. So if we start with imprisonment, okay, the most serious form of punishment that can be given. Prison sentences are handed down by the courts for the most serious offences. Remember, it's right at the top, so the most serious offences carry a prison sentence. And generally, it's for a serious offence or when the court believes that the public needs to be protected from the offender by removing the offender from society. So here's a useful stat for you to remember, and I would thoroughly recommend learning some stats for this and the remaining ACs. And all of these stats that I'm giving you can be used in future ACs as well. And I would have a bank of stats, because when you come to an evaluation question, having some statistics to back up the points you are making will get you the higher marks into the higher mark boundaries. So here's an interesting stat. Almost half of all the prisoners in the UK have been convicted of sex or violent offences. So that's the sentence, that's the form of punishment. So what aim of punishment does that reflect? Well, it reflects the aim of public protection, because these are dangerous people. They need to be locked up to protect the public from their crimes. So imprisonment particularly acts as a form of public protection. Now, that's fine, but we've also got to realise there are different types of prison sentence. So if you get a question on imprisonment meeting the aims of punishment, you need to go into a little more detail and talk about the different types of prison sentence. So we have indeterminate and life sentences, we've got determinate sentences, and we've got suspended sentences. So each of those will meet different aims compared to the others. So let's start with life sentences. It's the most serious punishment a court can hand down. So I would argue that shows the aim of retribution. The judge sets the minimum term that the offender must serve in prison before they're even considered for release, for parole. Now, I would argue that that is protection, therefore. So it's retribution and protection now, the life sentence. The parole board has to consider whether their relief is safe or suitable. So again, protection, this reflects protection and retribution. And if they are released on licence, they have to follow specific rules, conditions, and be supervised by the probation service. And if you go to my PowerPoint of the probation service, you'll see that in more detail. And I think there's an element of rehabilitation with that. So there I've got 1, 2, 3 of the 5 aims of punishment. That 1, 2, 3, 3 of 5 aims of punishment already for a life sentence, possibly. And if they break the terms of the licence, they're called back to prison. So that is deterrence. So 4 there of the 5. Now, mandatory compulsory life sentences have to be given for anyone who's found guilty of murder. So if you are convicted of murder, you will be given a life sentence. So retribution, protection, deterrence if you murder someone. Discretionary life sentences can also be given for more serious offences such as rape. So again, you've got retribution, protection and deterrence. And a judge can also sentence an offender to a whole life order, which means they'll never be released except in exceptional compassionate circumstances. Again, that is retribution, protection and deterrence. And remember, deterrence can be both individual and general. And of course, if you're seeing whole life sentences for serious crimes, that acts as a general deterrence to the rest of the public who see that offender being punished and think, oh, I don't want that to happen to me, therefore I won't commit that crime. So, as a useful stat here, in March 2025, 7,491 prisoners were serving some form of life sentence in prison. An example is this man here. He's been in the news fairly recently, Hashim Abedi. He was the brother of the Manchester Arena bomber. He was sentenced to a minimum term of 55 years. That is, to date, the longest minimum term. He was 23 years old when he was sentenced, and he couldn't be given a whole life sentence because he was under 21 when the crime was committed. So he is not going to be even eligible for parole until he's 78 years old. So unlikely to get out of prison ever. And whole life sentences where you never get out are usually given to offenders who've committed multiple murders. Now, as of June 2025, there were 82 people serving whole life sentences. So they will die in prison. They will not get out. They'll never be allowed parole. So I picked 3 of the most famous so you can illustrate this. So we've got old Robert Maudsley here. He's, I think, been in the longest. He's killed 4 people, committed 3 of these in prison. He's alleged to have eaten part of the brain of one of the 3 men he killed in prison, earned him the nickname Hannibal the Cannibal. He was sent to prison in 1977, and he has been in solitary confinement in a specially built cell in Wakefield Prison since 1983. Very similar to, if you watch Silence of the Lambs, what Hannibal Lecter is kept in. So he is our example of Hannibal Lecter. Then we've got the longest serving female on a whole life term, that is Rosemary West, who with her husband Frederick West, who committed suicide in jail, killed a total of 12 people, and she is never getting out. So you can read the rest of that at your will. And then this guy here, Wayne Couzens, who was convicted of the kidnapping murder of Sarah Everard in 2021. Now, interesting for him, and he's a good case to have, he did not commit multiple murders. He only killed one person, Sarah Everard, but because he was a member of the police and the judge ruled that he betrayed the public trust in the police. Remember that the police have their powers by public consent. It was the judge ruled that it was serious enough for him to have a whole life term. So he's another example that you could use. Now, you might want to touch on indeterminate life sentences. These were abolished in 2012, but there are still a large number of prisoners serving them because they were convicted before that date. Now, IPPs, indeterminate life sentences, which is imprisonment for public protection, is what it's called, it's now been replaced by what are called extended sentences. And extended sentences have a recommended tariff, and once the tariff's been served by the prisoners on extended sentences, they're assessed, and if they're judged to still be a danger, they're kept in prison for up to an extra 8 years. And usually those sentences are for violent or sexual offences, so another example of protection there. So these set a minimum time the offender must serve in prison, so we've got protection, we've got retribution. Offenders have no automatic right to be released, it's decided by parole board, so there's rehabilitation and protection there. Usually given if the court thinks the offender's a danger to the public, sometimes linked to mental health issues, so again it's rehabilitation and protection. And in June 2025 there are about 2,800 prisoners serving indeterminate sentences, but they are gradually being replaced by these extended sentences. And of course then we have determinate sentences, which is when you get a fixed length of time on your sentence. In March 2025 we had about 61,000 serving determinate sentences. Now if your sentence is under 12 months, usually the offender's released halfway through that. If the sentence is 12 months or more, they usually spend half that time in prison and the second half in the community on licence supervised by the probation service, although given the recent prison overcrowding, that's slightly less than half the time in prison because they're trying to free up some space. But that is definitely individual deterrence and rehabilitation. And any offender sentenced to less than 2 years, they're released on post-sentence supervision, usually for 12 months, with regular meetings with the probation officer and with specified requirements. And I'd argue that's individual deterrence and rehabilitation. And then finally we come to suspended sentences. The offender's given a prison sentence, but they don't go directly to prison. So I would argue that's rehabilitation and deterrence. Usually given if a prison sentence would have been less than 12 months, usually given for first offences, to be quite honest, and sentences can be suspended for up to 2 years. So there's rehabilitation and deterrence again. And the court might also require impose requirements on a suspended sentence, such as probation or drug treatment. And again, I would argue that's rehabilitation. And if the offender doesn't meet the requirements or commits a further offence, then the court can send them to prison to serve the original sentence. So again, there's a huge element of deterrence. And suspended sentences make up about 4% of offenders sentenced in 2024 across all courts. So useful stat for you there. Okay. So you might well get an evaluation question on this. Does imprisonment meet its punishment aims? Well, depends what aims we're talking about. We've got 5 of them, and we've got different imprisonment sentences to match those against. So if we take the aim of retribution, it's the idea that the offender deserves to be punished and that the punishment should fit the crime. Well, prison punishes people by taking away their freedom and imposing unpleasant living conditions on them. However, it's difficult to say whether imprisonment gives offenders their just deserts, so whether it gives them real retribution. For example, how do you decide exactly what length of sentence fits the different crimes? It's a purely subjective opinion. So something to consider that, something to argue if you're evaluating. When it comes to the aim of deterrence, this is a little more interesting. Some people argue that the risk of being sent to prison deters would-be offenders from committing crime, acts as general deterrence. So that, in that case, you could argue if that is the case, that's a good thing. it's effective. However, if we start to look at the high recidivism rates, particularly by people who've been to prison, that suggests that actually it's not an effective deterrent for many people. Nearly half of adult prisoners are re-convicted within a year of being released from jail. Nearly half. So deterrence only works if would-be offenders are capable of thinking and acting rationally. But of course, many offences are committed under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Many offenders are poorly educated, have mental health problems, and you could argue, therefore, that prison does not act as a deterrent for these type of offenders. It may be for some, but not for others. When it comes to public protection, incapacitation, that's another word for it, well, obviously, whole life sentences do keep offenders permanently off the street, so you can't argue against that. That's definitely the case. Prisoners serving indeterminate sentences, imprisonment for public protection, can be kept in jail for as long as they're deemed a danger to the public, so that's public protection, definitely. There's been a trend towards longer sentences, so the public are remaining protected from offenders for longer. That's a good thing. And most prisoners are released on licence, and when they're on licence, they're under supervision, and if they become a danger, they'll go back to prison. So you could argue there's an element of protection there as well. But many people have argued that prisons actually could be a school for crime, where actually you go to prison, prisoners acquire new skills, attitudes and contacts that actually lead them to offend after their release and potentially to commit more serious crimes. And as most prisoners are eventually released, you could argue that while prison may buy the public temporary protection, it could result in greater harm later on. And keeping people in prison is extremely costly. Critics argue that these funds could be used to pay for other ways of protecting the public. And the stat there, the cost of keeping a taxpayer, in 2024-25, the cost of the taxpayer keeping someone in prison for a year was £53,801, or £147.40 a day. That is a huge amount of money. As sentences have got longer, prisons have got more overcrowded, the burden on the taxpayer is immense. And as we now know, prisoners are being released earlier from their sentences, so because of the prison overcrowding, and therefore you could argue there's less public protection as a result of that. So, let's talk about reparation in prison. Now, reparation is the one aim of punishment that we haven't really discussed so far. There's a reason behind this. Reparation is allowing the offender to repair the damage caused by the offence, both to the victim and to the wider community, society. Now, does this really happen? I would argue, no, it doesn't. There is only one possible way that imprisonment could achieve reparation, and that is under the Prisoners' Earnings Act of 2011. Prisoners who are permitted to work outside of prison, usually in Cat D prisons, to prepare for their eventual release, can be made to pay a proportion of their earnings towards the cost of victim support services. Now, that would be an example of reparation. You could use it. However, in practice, very few prisoners have the opportunity to earn money in this way. And given the current crisis in the prison, they don't have the staff to supervise it anyway. So if anything, there are less and less prisoners having that opportunity as the prison population rises. So I think personally, I would argue that in general, imprisonment does little to meet the aim of reparation, although you could well allude to the Prisoners' Earnings Act of 2011 if you wanted to. So hopefully that's made sense. So let's talk about rehabilitation. So rehabilitation involves changing an offender so they no longer offend and instead lead a crime-free life. Although it's a goal of imprisonment, in reality, prisons have a very poor record of reducing recidivism, as the latest government stats from January-March of 2023 suggest. These are the latest ones I could get. 33.8% of prisoners reoffend. That's not good. For those who serve a sentence of less than 12 months, the figure rises to 57%. That is not good. And 37,573 prisons were recalled to prison for breach of their licence conditions in 2024. That is also not good, and suggests that rehabilitation has not been effective for a large amount of prisoners who've been put in prison. So prison, you could argue, doesn't work effectively at rehabilitating prisoners. Short sentences are one reason for this failure. Nearly half of all sentences are for 6 months or less, which means there isn't enough time to get to grips with long-term problems that cause offending, such as mental health issues or addiction. And short sentences have been found to be far less effective than community sentences at reducing reoffending. So, does prison rehabilitate? I think I might err on the side of no, largely. And education and training, even for prisoners with longer sentences, increasingly as the prison population is expanding and there's less staff to do these things, opportunities to deal with the cause of their offending, prepare them for a crime-free life, teaching them a trade, etc., educate them in prison, are often limited. Only a fifth of prisoners have a job to go to on release, and that's partly because many lack the educational skills needed. And this stat, in 2023-24, 73% of prisoners had a literacy level of an 11-year-old. That is 5 times higher than the general population, which is 15%. 5 times higher as it is. And that's according to the Bromley briefing of 2025. So 73% of prisoners have got the literacy level of an 11-year-old. Imagine you're all doing A levels, so at 11 your literacy level would have been much higher than that of an 11-year-old. So imagine if you were applying, you're filling in a job application, going for a job interview with a literacy level of an 11-year-old. How well were you likely to do at getting a job? So that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed through education. And if prisons aren't educating, you cannot reform, in my opinion. So that's what you could argue about rehabilitation. So let's evaluate it. Does it meet its punishment aims? Well, I would argue with rehabilitation, opportunities for education, vocational training or meaningful work are limited. So release on temporary licence can allow prisoners out of prison on day release to attend work or training, but actually fewer than 400 a month, 0.5% of prisoners get this opportunity. And addressing that offending behaviour, there's a massive shortage on courses that address offender behaviour, such as anger management programmes. Many prisoners on indeterminate public protection sentences remain in prison due to lack of programmes that could address their violent behaviour. So that is a big issue. So all those issues together sum up the case for imprisonment. You've got how it meets the various aims and whether it meets those aims effectively or not. Lots of grist to the mill there, plenty more than 9 marks and some stats there to help you. So let's move on to community sentences. Now, they're imposed for offences that are too serious for a discharge or a fine, but not as serious as a prison sentence. So a community order given by the court will have one or more requirements, such as supervision by a probation officer, or between 40 and 300 hours unpaid work, otherwise known as community payback, a curfew or an exclusion order, a residency requirement, e.g. you've got to live in a supervised probation approved hostel, or a group program such as anger management, drink driving, etc., or treatment for drug or alcohol addiction, including testing for mental health problems. So those are the sort of requirements that could be put in on a community sentence. So obviously, you've then got to apply the aims of punishment to those various different types of community sentences. So this is not an exhaustive list. So let's have a think about this. In general, let's take the aim of retribution. Well, all community sentences have some element of retribution within them. For example, a curfew and an exclusion order restrict offenders' movements at certain times and places. That's definitely a form of retribution. Doing unpaid work, having to wear high-vis vests with community payback on the back, the public naming and shaming that this involves, well, that's definitely retribution, without a shadow of a doubt. When it comes to reparation, well, doing unpaid work to repair the damage that offenders caused the victim's property. Equally, reparation maybe to the whole community through unpaid work on community payback, such as removing graffiti, clearing wasteland, decorating public building, such as a community sentence. Well, that's fine. That's definitely reparation. But rehabilitation, deterrence and protection, now there's lots of different ways you can argue it. I've argued it one way. So it would be possible to argue that by undertaking community payback, an offender might see the effect their crime has on the community and as a result of this be rehabilitated. I think I'd argue that rehabilitation is much more likely to occur if they've undertaken a successful group program or treatment for drug or alcohol addiction. Whether or not they act as a form of deterrence or protection, I suppose you could argue that tagging, curfews are a sense of protection, but you can argue either way, and I'll let you decide how you wish to argue. It doesn't matter, there's no right or wrong in this, you've just got to be able to give the reasons why you think the aim matches or it doesn't match. Either way is absolutely fine. Moving on to fines. Well, they're financial penalties for get your teeth in sprinkle. Fines are financial penalties for offending, normally given for less serious offences and therefore very often given by magistrates' courts. But even in more serious indictable offences, only about 15% of those found guilty receive a fine. So it's not a common sentence. And the size of the fine depends on the following factors. So it will depend on the offence itself. The law lays down a maximum fine for certain offences, for instance. The circumstances of the crime, the sentencing guidelines give a range of options depending on whether it was a first offence, how much harm's been done, etc., etc. And then also it depends on the offender's ability to pay. A poorer defendant will probably receive a smaller fine and or be allowed to pay in instalments. So just a caveat here, please note the textbooks are wrong. Magistrates' courts now have no limit on the fines they can impose. So let's drill down a bit on fines. So I think you could argue they're retribution because hitting someone in the pocket could be a good way to make them suffer for the harm they've done. That's fine. But on the flip side of that, you could bring in this idea that younger offenders under the age of 16 don't have to pay their fines. It becomes the responsibility of their parents. So if that's the case, very hard to see how that acts as retribution. If we're talking about deterrence, I think you could say that a fine does act as deterrent. It may make an offender reluctant to reoffend for fear of further punishments. Because as the use of fines is a common way of disposing of first-time offenders, fines actually signal that worse will follow if they reoffend. Remember, they'll be moving up that scale of sentencing, fines, community sentences, imprisonment. So possibly you could argue for deterrence. And I've lumped protection, reparation, and rehabilitation in together. And I've put, well, whilst the money raised from a fine may go some way to giving reparation to both the victim and society. So, for example, in Devon, I don't know if this happens in other counties, but if you are caught speeding and you have to go on a speed awareness course, the money raised from a speed awareness course is used to finance bikeability courses in primary schools in Devon, teaching kids to be safe on the roads. So that, I would argue, is an example of reparation, but it's hard to see how fines provide protection or rehabilitation in some ways. You can argue either way. And of course, offenders who fail to pay their fines may face prison. So courts could deduct fines from offenders' benefits or sending bailiffs to seize their property in the event of non-payment, which is all well and good. However, and I think this is the stat I would use, many fines do not get paid. So by December 2024, the backlog of unpaid fines and court surcharges was £4.4 billion. Now, we've been looking at how much the various agencies of the criminal justice system are financed. £4.4 billion is actually more than some of the money that they get each year to dispose what they're supposed to do. Many of those fines have been written off as completely uncollectible. So you could argue that this suggests that fines don't always meet the aim of punishment. £4.4 billion, huge amount of money. So that then leads us on to discharges. So when a court finds someone guilty of a minor, usually a first-time offence, and decides not to hand down a criminal conviction, they'll usually be given a discharge. Now, lots of people ask, well, does that mean you've got a criminal record? Well, technically, you've been found guilty in court, so you do have a criminal record, but there's a way around it, which I'll explain towards the end of this slide. So there are two types of discharge. A conditional discharge, which means the offender will not be punished unless they commit another offence within a set period of time determined by the court. Discharge periods typically up to 3 years, during which obviously the defendant must not commit another offence. And then there's an absolute or unconditional discharge, which means no penalties imposed. The court may grant an absolute discharge when the defendant's technically guilty, but where punishment would be inappropriate because the defendant's morally blameless. Now that leads us on to this idea of, does it mean you've got a criminal record? Well, even though discharges can only be made after a defendant is convicted, so they've either got to be they've got to have pleaded guilty or be found guilty following a trial, because a discharge is still a sentence which results from being found guilty. Effectively, what happens is the conviction becomes spent immediately in the case of an absolute discharge. So effectively found guilty, but your conviction is spent. So it's not hanging there anymore. And if it's a conditional discharge, so you've got that possibility that you've got there's a discharge period, those 3 years, it becomes spent after the discharge period in the case of a conditional discharge. And that's all set out in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974. Now, spent convictions are not contained on a basic criminal record. So effectively, if you have an absolute or unconditional discharge, because the conviction is spent instantly, it won't appear on a basic criminal record. It'll be on your criminal record for an absolute or a conditional discharge for the time of that discharge. After that, it's gone. Okay. Also, spent convictions are not recorded as part of a basic disclosure and barring check. So when you have a DBS check to see whether you can work with kids, that sort of thing, they won't show up, but can be revealed on a standard or enhanced check. So that's just to clarify what actually a discharge entails. So finally, last slide, do discharges meet their punishment aims? Well, I think the basic aims of discharges is deterrence. They're the lowest level of punishment and are in effect a warning as to the individual's future conduct. So in general, I would say there's a very low rate of reoffending following a discharge, especially if it's for a first offence, probably because for many first offenders, the experience of simply going to court is enough for them to mend their ways. So I think I would be tempted to say discharges do meet their aims of punishment, which is deterrence. So that is how the aims meet the forms. There's lots of different ways you can argue it. You have to be aware of what the aims are. You've really got to learn them. You've got to be aware of what the forms are and the different forms within the subcategory, the different forms of community sentences, the different forms of imprisonment, etc. Fines and discharges are pretty straightforward. You don't have to go with everything that I've said. You can form your own opinions. It doesn't matter specifically if you're evaluating. You've just got to be able to back up your arguments. And having some stats to help you do that, to argue one way or the other, will get you into those top mark brackets. I hope you found that useful. And hopefully I'll see you again for my next video. Take care. Have a good day. Goodbye.